Hi, I'm Kelly Ryder, the founder of English Learner Portal. And today for the Spring Summit, I want to share with you a strategy, well, it's a combination of strategies that I like to use when doing literacy activities with students. For this model, I'm focusing more on the lower proficiency levels, but we'll definitely talk as I go through about how you can adjust it for the higher proficiency levels. So I'm going to share my screen with you and take you through my slides to show you what an arts integrated early literacy collaborative writing type lesson would look like. We like to start lessons with a messy objective. So I'm going to talk this through and model it for you. So our lesson objective for today is that we can create a collaborative narrative and read our narrative to each other. So what does that mean we're going to do today? What is create? Give me some ideas. What is create? And this is the conversation I would be having with my students. And they would toss out their answers, and I would take my marker and write on the chart or on the board. All right, create means we're going to make something, or we're going to build something. What about collaborative? We're going to make or build something collaborative. What does collaborative mean? It means that we're going to do it together. Now, right now, I'm giving all the answers, but if I was with students, they would be chiming in their words, because when it's in their words, they understand it better, of course. Okay, so we're going to make something together. We're going to make a narrative. So what is a narrative? Hopefully, they will say a narrative is a story. A narrative is when you tell a story. All of those, jot them down on the chart. That's great. We are going to create a collaborative narrative. We're going to make or build together this story. So you can see, go back to the original academic language and restate it in the words they gave you, and keep repeating it as you go through so it's really clear. Right? So after we create our collaborative narrative, after we make our story together, we build a new story together, we're going to read our narrative to each other. Right? So we're going to read together, and we can add a visual in here to make that. So let's go through one more time. We can create a collaborative narrative and read our narrative to each other. All right, so what are we going to do again? And then have a few students have a chance to say that. It's academic language practice, vocabulary, repetition, and really starts to get students focused on what our goal is today. Now, we'll talk about developing specific language goals in this in just a minute. But if you already knew your language goal, you could add that in here, saying using plural nouns, or using the past tense, or using exciting adjectives, or using more complex sentences. Whatever it is you're going to focus on, you could add that into the objective as well. And they could really be thinking about the language you want as you go. All right, so that is our strategy debrief. Why messy objectives? It helps focus students. It's a background knowledge builder, our refresher to bring back the words that you've been talking about, to review that vocabulary, make sure they really know what the goal is so that you can stay focused in your lesson. I would keep that objective handy, either on a slide or a chart paper or on the board, and then refer to it often through the lesson. If we start to wander a little off track, just say, let's go back and read our messy objective again. Remind ourselves what we're doing. Or partway through, we can say, let's check our objective again. This is what we said we were going to do. Are we doing well at sticking with that? And evaluate ourselves, and then go back to it at the end, and we'll say, did we accomplish this today? So the objective becomes a crucial part in the lesson to make sure we stay clear and focused along the way. All right, now for the planning. We call this type of lesson a whole to part lesson. And actually the way I'm talking you through it, it becomes more of a part to whole to part. I'll explain that as we go. So how do we plan this type of lesson? There are a few things I want you to keep in mind as we go that need to be included in this lesson. All good lessons that involve the desire to develop language, no matter what language it is, no matter what the content area, all lessons should have interaction, student-to-student interaction, should have comprehensibility, where we're doing something to make sure we're developing their understanding, we're making sure that everyone is getting comprehensible input, we're making sure they're following, and they're getting the big ideas as we go. And we want to make sure we're always focused on critical thinking. We're really focused on grade level standards. The grade level standards of writing a narrative, I kept it pretty vague because this could be any grade level, but you may want to zone in on what is specifically asked for in a narrative in your grade level to get more specific and make sure that your target is incorporating critical thinking and maintaining grade level expectations. Right? Super important there. So once we think about how we're going to work that in, then we want to think about comprehensible input. So this goes back in the 70s. Dr. Stephen Krashen, famous linguist, talked about the comprehensible input hypothesis. And what this really boils down to in language is like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, sorry about that, or all of that where it says that in order to learn, you need to stay within a certain stretch of your comfort zone. So if we're going to stretch our language, if we aim too high, we'll lose students in the language. If we stay too low, they will get bored and they won't grow. So we have to look at where students are right now, what's their proficiency level, what's their content knowledge level, and then what's a step above that? What am I pushing for in language, and what am I pushing for them to demonstrate in content that would be one step higher than where they currently are? Think about it in terms of guided reading when you are assigning a text that is independent level versus instructional level. We also, in our lesson, want to consider the 3 features of academic language as WIDA states. If you're a WIDA state, this is all through your expectations when it comes to assessments and curriculum and standards for English learners. If you're not a WIDA state, you have something very similar in the rubrics for speaking and writing in your different sets of standards and assessments, because it is language development. It's the research of language development, and it's very well established, whether it be WIDA or a WELPA or another state. Whatever's going on, you have something very similar. So we want to look at the word level. We're looking at the vocabulary we want students to use. We want to develop the sentence level, which means we're looking at sentence structures and how are we growing them there. And we want to look at the discourse level of how are we putting it all together and making a cohesive text that flows and makes sense and uses a little bit more extensive language. And we also want that discourse to include student-to-student conversation where they're talking about what they think about whatever the content is we're going to use for writing and reading. So more on this as we move forward. I'll show you where it comes into play. So I start the lesson with a visual for students. An arts integration strategy. This isn't necessarily arts in the way you think of it. You could use a painting or a drawing. I'm thinking of a science unit where the students have been talking about plants and what plants need and the parts of a plant, lower elementary levels. And so I chose a picture that would elicit that kind of vocabulary and give us some background knowledge and information. So we're going to start with that interaction and discourse. We really want to be thinking about this picture, give students time. This is a great place for think, pair, share. Look at the picture and think to yourself quietly first, what do you see? You can name things, you can talk about it, whatever they want to say about this picture. The goal is to give them a few minutes to think. Then you can do a turn and talk, a think, pair, share. Talk to your partner about what you see and what you think is happening in this picture. Right? Right? Get some of that language going before we switch to literacy. When we're ready to switch to literacy, I usually start chart paper, or it can be done electronically. I still love that marker paper. I feel like the act of writing it and then seeing it written really helps to remember. So I start a chart paper, and for right now we're focusing on word level. I just want words. What kind of words were you using when you were talking to your partner about this picture? Now, they may answer you in sentences, which is great, but you're going to break it down to words, and you're going to start recording individual words that then becomes a word bank for them to use later. So, for example, as we talk through, they might say grandmother, an aunt, a grandma, a girl, a child, a young. You can elicit some of that. Well, what would you call this, or what would you call that? What is grandma holding? And try to get as much vocabulary out as you can. This is where I want you to think about that I+1. What are you looking for language-wise? So if your students are ready for singular plural, you want to make sure you get some of those on this chart. If you are going to be looking for past tense, then instead of putting grow on your chart, or plant, or let's see, what else do I have in there for? You want, or helping, you would put on the past tense version, because that's what you're going to use. Or you might put the present and the past, and later students will have to decide which is the right one. So I might put grow, grew, or plant, planted, you know, because we're not sure yet how we're going to go with that, but you know where you're headed. So you have already thought this through. You know what kinds of words you want on your chart. When students surprise you with words you hadn't really thought of or expected, you know, I'm thinking singular plural, I'm thinking past, present. If you're thinking adjectives, I didn't include many because I'm thinking a little lower level. I'm just trying to get simple sentences out right now. But you could definitely, you know, put in lots of juicy adjectives. Whatever your focus is, you need to know that ahead of time and be very careful about what goes on this chart so it becomes a support for those goals you have in mind and not just a chart of random words. Okay? Then as we move forward, we go through, here are some things I brainstormed that could be the possible teaching topics. You could do nouns and pronouns because you're going to say grandma and the girl, then you might switch to they, then you might say she, and then you might say the girl. So if you know that's something you want to work on, that's a possibility. You want to make sure those get on your chart. Singular and plural we talked about. Moving into the sentence level, what do you want to focus on? Do you want to add in adjectives? Do you want to combine sentences with conjunctions? Do you want to put some comparatives? You know, grandma is older than the girl. Or is that not important right now if we're talking about science? You decide. It's your lesson. Words to show time. Early in the morning. It was in the afternoon when. Later that day. What could they add to their story to help the sentence level and then eventually lead into that discourse level where they're going to organize their thoughts into a cohesive flow to create that narrative. And you want to make sure it has a beginning, middle, end. But we're not even there yet to talk about with students. But you're thinking about it as the teacher, and you're planning for it because you are guiding them to the right point. All right. Now, what I would do from here is leave that chart up and say, okay, let's go back to our objective. We said we're going to create a narrative. We're going to write a story. So let's start thinking about some of the ideas that are going to go in our story. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has to have characters. So who are our characters? It has to have a setting. What's our setting in this picture? You can kind of do a little brainstorming, do some turn and talk. Make sure you want to keep it interactive, not all teacher-led. And then as students start, let me record some of your ideas, okay? Student number 1, what do you think? The grandma is teaching the girl to plant flowers. I will write that down on our chart or on a sentence strip. We'll see where that goes and you can decide. Whatever ideas they come up with, you're writing them down. You're not writing the story yet. You're just writing down their ideas that will go in the story. They can be in any order They can be, you know, all over the place in time sequence, as long as they make sense and are using the right vocabulary and right structures that you're focusing on. You may need to reword, tweak a little. You just want a string of sentences about this picture. I sometimes put them on the chart paper and then cut up the chart paper. I sometimes write them directly on sentence strips. It really depends on the level of student. In this lesson, I'm focusing on reading, so I'm doing most of the writing, but you can also flip-flop that and have students do the writing, so you can have a focus going that way first. Completely up to you. Lots of tweaks for this type of lesson. So here are some pictures when we did this in a workshop not long ago with teachers, where they went through this process and they put their sentences on sentence strips, and then they could play with the order. They got into groups. This is where the collaboration interaction comes in, because we said we're going to write a collaborative narrative. So they can choose some of the sentences from our chart that we made. They don't need to use all of them. They can choose some from here. They could make their own if they're ready for that. You decide. I told these groups they needed 3 sentences because they're adults and we were just modeling. You could say you need 5 sentences, whatever you want it to be. They put it in order, lots of tape, and then we start playing with the collaborative part. And we start then talking about the discourse level. Does it make sense in that order? What could we add so that we know the order? And that's where we'll go back to our language of time and say first, then, finally, like this group did. Or you may say early in the morning they planted the seeds. A week later they went back to check on them. However you want it to go. This editing portion will be future lessons as you go. In this particular workshop, we talked about how to add in details and how to add in quotes and things like that. This would be for a much higher level and do a lot more higher level editing. Totally up to you, but I'm focusing on the lower level right now, where I just want them to get a couple sentences that make a cohesive paragraph and a quick story, and we're good to go. So then we start the whole to part of the process. We have a text. I would do this if it's the lower levels the first time around as a group text, that we created one narrative together as a group with me leading them. And I would read aloud our final version so they get fluency and flow. They hear it read fluently. Then we all choral read it. So again, it's repetition, repetition, repetition. Then I could go back and select parts of it to highlight to teach in mini lessons. So I might go back and say, hey, let's look at those pronouns. Or let's go back and check and make sure our singular and plural nouns are correct. Or let's make sure we're always in past tense, because this is a story that happened last summer. You decide. But that's where you take the whole text and you break it down to the parts. You might do initial consonant sounds if you're going way back. You might do, let's circle all the sight words, our high frequency words, and practice those. You pick a part of the whole that you focus on for mini lessons. It could be a different one as a warm-up each day for a couple days. You can reuse this text. Totally up to you. Once the students have heard this text over and over, and they had the words on your word bank, and they had the sentences as samples, and they have all this conversation and practice, I will guarantee you that they can then begin to start partner reading that text without you. It should be above their independent level, thinking I+1. You don't want to write it too high. We want them to be successful, but we do want to push them. They should be able to produce a text that is slightly higher than their independent level, that will push them in their independent reading to read something a little bit more difficult. So partner reading with you watching, take turns, read it together, read it chorally with your partner, however they want to do it. Cut it up, put it back together, cut the sentences, put them back together. All kinds of work with that text. And then they're going to start doing the independent reading and writing. So from here, I would say, after all that you've done, now I want you to write your own independent narrative where you're going to use all of these ideas. You can steal a couple of the sentences, but it can't be exactly the same. And I want you to write your ideas on sentence strips or on little strips of paper. I want you to put it together in order to work on discourse. And then you are going to put this into a whole narrative. They could illustrate, they could make a book, they could do a million different things with it. So that's a lot. I hope that gives you an idea of how you can take an image from any content area, develop vocabulary, develop word level, sentence level, discourse level, and do a lot of repetition and practice, build in those basic literacy skills, and have a very well-rounded series of lessons. I mean, this could be small group across a whole week, or begin whole group and move into differentiated small groups, where some groups are doing simple sentences and then another group is using the same picture, same idea, but they're doing more complex sentences. And then you have your higher group who should really have the whole thing together with the time, the adjectives, the conjunctions. They should have the whole shebang. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Visit the website